I'm very pleased to welcome Heather Harpham this evening to talk about Happiness, The Crooked Little Road to Semi-Ever After, which is her memoir. And as the subtitle implies, the road to happiness can be twisty, especially when you have a gravely ill child. I'm going to be careful not to give too much away, so I'll just say that it's a book full of heartache and drama and inspiration. And there was a glowing profile in the Chicago Tribune earlier this week that read in part, "If a heartbreaking work of staggering genius wasn't already a book title, I would apply it to Happiness, a Memoir." And it went on to call this utterly gorgeous, the story of life with a seriously sick child. Harpham is perhaps best known as a playwright. She's written 6 solo plays, including a theater piece about the experience chronicled in this book. And her work has appeared in a variety of magazines and journals. She currently teaches at Sarah Lawrence and at SUNY Purchase, and we're very happy to have her here as part of the launch of her book. So please help me welcome Heather.
Thanks, Susan, for such a generous introduction. And I'm delighted to be in this store, which is legend in my mind, but a place I have never been before. So I always have to move the mic down. I've yet to meet a mic at my height. So I won't say much except to sort of orient all of us to where I'm going to begin the reading, in where we are in the narrative arc. I'll read for maybe 15 minutes, and then I'm very happy to take questions or comments or just to sit around and talk. So as Susan said, this is a book that has a sick child at the center of it, but I hope there is enough parallel narrative streams to cushion that sort of the pain of that central theme. I really appreciate that you said I'm not going to give too much away. If you read, if you come upon any other press about the book, most of it will tell you how things turn out. But in the spirit of that, I wrote the book with that intention to keep ultimate outcomes a question mark in the reader's mind, because that's the way lived experience is, right? You don't know the ending beat by beat, and so I'll preserve that for tonight's reading at least. I'll say that although it's not really necessary to the reading, the other sort of central love story besides the love between a parent or parents and a child that's in this book is the love story of how those two people got together in the first place. And so there's a relationship, and that's sort of in the first part of the book. And when you're at the point where I'm reading, myself and my child's father have been estranged and then reconciled, for whatever that's worth. We're going to enter at a point where they're back together and sort of figuring out next steps with this sick baby, they being we. It is a memoir. And we're in the doctor's office. Have you considered having another child? Dr. Kerper shifted in her seat. Brian and I stared at her. When you have one sick baby, the absolute last thing in the world you want is another sick baby. Listen, Dr. Kerper continued, undaunted. Amelia Grace could be cured, full stop, with a bone marrow transplant. The first step is to find a donor. The better the match, the higher the success rate. A sibling match is best. Kids with a sibling match have the highest rate of survival. A sibling match? Survival rates? She seemed to be speaking in tongues. We don't know what is broken, but if we take out the old engine and replace it with a new engine, the car will run. The car will run? Brian said, making her analogy sound as banal and useless as it was inscrutable. I gave him a murderous look. The transplant gives her a new engine, new bone marrow. Gracie is the car, Dr. Kerper said. After a year and a half of constant blood transfusions, after a year and a half of false hope and wrong turns, Dr. Kerper had finally stopped promising that this undiagnosable disease would spontaneously resolve. She was admitting defeat. The disease was not going to get any better. Gracie would continue to require blood transfusions for the rest of her life unless we could eradicate the disease, cure her, could make her better. Amelia Grace can be cured with a transplant, she said. I can refer you to the pediatric bone marrow team here for a consult. Brian looked stricken. A bone marrow transplant, he said. That sounds like an extreme solution to a problem we haven't even defined yet. His tone, as he said, bone marrow transplant, made it sound like a terrible thing to do to a child, like leaving Gracie by the side of the road with a can, like leaving Gracie by the side of the road with nothing but a cardboard sign that read Toledo and a warm can of Dr. Pepper. I, on the other hand, only heard cured. I squeezed Brian's knee, momentarily euphoric, until I remembered that this undertaking outlined by Dr. Kerper rested on the premise of having another baby, out of the question. Dr. Kerper knew our history. She'd been Amelia Grace's doctor before our reconciliation. I'd had the vague impression that she was pulling for us as a couple, but surely this had nothing to do with that. Surely she was in earnest. But, Brian said, we've assumed that having another baby would risk meaning having another sick baby. Dr. Kerper was quiet for a beat. Was this little hitch in the plan only now occurring to her? Since we haven't been able to diagnose Amelia Grace, it's true that we can't give you reliable odds on your chances of having a child with the same disease, she said. But think it over. She'd never need another blood transfusion. She'd be cured, and you could go back to being a normal family. I suppressed a snort. Back? My thoughts flew in confused circles, tangling and looping, doubling back on each other. How could we put our daughter into a situation with published survival rates? I didn't want a transplant for my child or anyone else's, but I also didn't want to have a very sick kid who grew into a very sick adult if we were lucky. The one question I'd been afraid to ask and had put off asking while searching for a diagnosis was no longer avoidable. I made my whole body still and took a breath. If she doesn't get better, if she needs lifelong blood transfusions, what are those survival rates? I don't like to give those kind of statistics, Dr. Kerper said. People become very attached to the numbers. Please, I said, we know they're just numbers. Dr. Kerper looked from me to Brian and back again. Transfusion-dependent patients in the last available data have a 50% chance of reaching age 30. I thought I might slap her, one sharp blow just to bring her to her senses. Okay, I said, we'll be in touch. I gathered my purse. Brian stood up and took my hand. I knew without looking at his face that he would be tight-lipped, foreboding, knew he shared my view that Dr. Kerper's statistics were unnecessarily hostile. Never mind that I'd pressed, almost begged for them. How dare she say that out loud? I wanted to be with Gracie immediately. I needed to touch her pudgy hands, smell her thin, silky hair, to inhale her sweet toddler breath. When we got to the lobby, we found my mom alternately reading People magazine and watching Gracie cruise around the perimeter of chairs. Gracie was wearing a summer dress with a giant pink and orange flower pattern. As she moved, the hem kept riding up. Her small legs, plump and strong, propelled her around the lobby at top speed. What kind of creepy statistician would bet against such a girl? I chased her and kissed her and smelled her. She squirmed to get down as if I'd interrupted her at work. I wanted to whisper in her ear, "You will be 30, and then 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. You will be 90 and then 100. You will be so old and so decrepit. You'll be baggy with age and decay." Doesn't that sound nice? Walking to the parking garage, hand in hand, Brian and I said nothing. We were suddenly the parents of a girl who might or might not see 30, and that somehow felt like a personal failing. We'd made someone with an expiration date. My mom said goodbye to us in the lot. She was off to do errands, her eternal errands. When I hugged her goodbye, she whispered, "I don't know what the doctor said to make you two so grim, but doctors don't know everything. Look at her. She's perfect." I looked at my daughter. She was chubby, currently pink, humming a wordless, happy opera. She was a baby from Central Casting with a time bomb inside. I thanked my mom, and we got in the car. I was driving. As I pulled out of the garage, the city spread below us, a rippled, silvery skirt rising and falling with the hills, hemmed with the blue of the bay. It was an infuriatingly perfect day. Why would the weather never corroborate one's mood? The baby sputtered in the back, and the bay sputtered with light, transmitting its secret code in a series of blinks and flashes. Blue, 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 silver, silver, blue. "Relax," the signal said. "Everything is okay. The baby might be sick, but she's going to get well. Someday, she's going to get an apartment at the top of one of these hills. She'll count herself among the supremely lucky who get to live in Northern California." I was on Lombard Street, approaching the bridge, with both hands on the wheel, when a midnight blue SUV swerved fully into our lane. The driver seemed to hold a beautifully naive belief that two objects can occupy the exact same time and space. I pulled hard to the right, and our car jumped the curb. Thank God the sidewalk was empty. The SUV driver drove merrily on. At the next stoplight, she was chatting on the cell phone, head tossed back, laughing. If you're going to nearly kill us, I thought, at least have the courtesy to do it on purpose. I put the car in park, got out, and walked up to her window. She kept chatting. I knocked. Finally, she turned to look. I pointed behind her. "Do you see that car?" She nodded her head. "There is a baby in the back of that car who needs blood transfusions to stay alive. Can you see her?" The woman made the universal palms down, calm down gesture. "Do you see the baby or not?" She just stared at me. Risk assessment. "That baby has enough trouble surviving without your fucking murderous phone calls." Brian got out of the car. "Heather," he said, "you've made some fine points. Now it's time to go." I looked at the woman. She didn't seem like she got my points at all. The traffic light turned green. She was gone. I walked back to the car. Brian was behind the wheel. "I'll drive," he said. "I can drive. I'm a great driver." "You are." Brian said, "You are a legendary driver." But he didn't get out. I walked around to the passenger seat. "She tried to kill us with her Lexus," I said. He put one hand on my knee. "I'm always so impressed by the way you know the brands of cars." "But did you see that?" "I did. I saw that," he said. His "that" seemed to encompass my actions as much as the woman's. Thankfully, Gracie had slept peacefully as I'd wandered around in live traffic, cussing people out. As we crossed over the Golden Gate, I remembered some pop psychology book I'd once read that said anger, in search of an appropriate target where none exists, We'll aim at whatever is handy. Maybe the Lexus woman was handier than a blood disease, but I said nothing of the kind to Brian. Chances were he'd be my next target, and I didn't want to help him disarm me. After dinner, something veggie for him, something meatish for me, and minuscule pieces of both for Gracie, we put her to bed with her favorite book, Good Night, Moon. Good night, kittens. Good night, mouse. Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. This book, once beloved, now sounded sinister. Good night was uncomfortably close to goodbye. After Gracie fell asleep, Brian and I sat on our narrow deck overlooking the stream and talked about everything Dr. Kerper had said. Each of us, in our own way, was trying to metabolize the shock of her statistic. If we did not give her a transplant, we had a 50% chance of knowing our daughter at age 50. She had only a 50% chance of knowing herself for 30 years. We calculated the odds of her reaching various ages. Did she have a 100% chance of reaching the age of 12, 14, 18, a 75% chance of reaching 25, 50-50 chance of reaching age 30, Brian said. I didn't expect to hear that. Bone marrow transplant, I said. I didn't expect to hear that. Me either. But cure sounds good. I'm crazy about cure. Yeah, but to get to cure, you have to take your kid through hell. And there's no guarantee she'll walk out. Also, what would we cure her with? We have no sibling. And even if we wanted to give her a sibling, we can't be sure that the new baby would be born healthy. Can you imagine having 2 sick kids at the same time? No, I said, even though I was in fact picturing 2 wan, limp babies side by side in a double stroller that Brian and I, side by side, push uphill, always up, never down, for all eternity. Besides, Brian said, we only have a 1 in 4 chance of having a kid who, if they're healthy, is going to match her well enough for transplant. 25%, those odds stink. I looked at him. My glass half-empty guy, who I suspected was secretly a glass half-full guy. We were doomed. I did not want to be doomed. I rejected doom, but I couldn't see a clear path through the numbers to daylight. And there was this. Was it ethical to have a second child to save the first child? Who on earth wants to arrive as a parachute, a backup plan? We can't risk it, Brian said. We can't, I said, and we won't. Brian put his hand out for mine and stood up. I'm going to putter for a while and then watch 24. By putter, Brian meant write. Despite his worst fears, he had been miraculously inventively finding time to write inside family life. I sat listening to his rhythms and the creaks. I was waiting for some kind of epiphany, which I knew wouldn't come. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, the Feast of the Epiphany is sometimes celebrated with Vasilopita, the baked bread with a lucky coin inside. Whoever receives the slice containing the coin will have a blessed year. But there was no way to slice our loaf for the lucky coin, unless the present moment was luck enough. Gracie, asleep in her crib, Brian puttering and waiting for me in the bedroom. 2 weeks later, I was pregnant, which was impossible. It was a defy the laws of physics, common sense, chemistry, and the rules of reproduction pregnancy. A throw your hands in the air and demand to know who's responsible for this pregnancy. That day you went for a run, Brian said. I've gone for runs before, I said, and not gotten pregnant. I sat silent, clutching the stick, stupefied. Brian stood beside me. "This is wonderful," he said, "and terrifying. It's both." "I'm not good at both," I said. "I'm good at one or the other." At our next visit, I shared the news with Dr. Kerper. "This is thrilling." She pushed her gray blonde bob behind her ears. "This is really delightful news." Sure, it was thrilling. So was ice skating across a thawing lake. "What about the new baby being born sick?" I said. Dr. Kerper picked up Gracie's chart and held it against her chest like a shield. "Well, as we've discussed, it's difficult to say without a diagnosis. We can't really calculate genetic heredity." Here, for once, Brian emerged again as the optimist. "But we have a 1 in 4 chance that the new baby will match her, right?" "Right." We decided to go away for a few days and stop thinking. My dad offered us a house he'd once rented up the coast in Gualala. "Water is good," he said. "Take the baby and play by the beach, my treat." It was a fabulous house, huge and clean and modern, set a few hundred yards away from a cliff that dropped down to the beach below. We unpacked, settled. After lunch, I found Brian in a downstairs bedroom reading and listening to Van Morrison. I love Van Morrison. Brian loves Bob Dylan, but he'd put on Van. We lay side by side to listen. "She's as sweet as Tupelo honey. She's an angel of the first degree." I'd been listening to this song since it came out in 1971 when I was 4, and now, 31 years later, it made new sense to me. Gracie sense. That's what kids do. They remake your world. "Are you happy?" Brian asked. I laid my head on his forearm. "I might be," I said. I wanted to be happy. I was scared and poorly equipped for hardship. That much was certain. Happiness is episodic. It's hard to know when you've caught its coattail. Anyway, when did happiness become the one golden ring we reach for? How about being guided by what is right or ethical or meaningful, or by making, as Brian sometimes called it, the growth choice? That sounded good, but I wasn't mature. I'd always aimed for what brought me most joy. The safer, smarter, maybe even wiser choice was no new baby. But the joy choice was yes. Or at least that was the choice with the highest probability of joy. True, a pile of potential anguish lay on the opposite side of the scale, but this is the deal in life, the inevitable twofer of joy and misery in their boxer's clinch. This new baby, 10 or 30 years from now, might make me hear a song in a brand new way. Surely they would dilate someone's understanding of the world. Likely many someone's. "Okay," I said. "Okay? Okay, yes." Brian broke into a smile and took my hand. Yes to another child who might be sick. Yes to having 2 children under 2 at the same time. Yes to Brian. Yes, yes, yes to drool, late nights, mutual accusations. Yes to euphoria. Yes to the probable, the impossible, the impractical. Yes to boy. Yes to girl. Yes, if need be, to a Cabbage Patch Kid. Yes to the whole crazy doomed mess. Yes to whoever had chosen us. Yes, we choose you back. Yes to life. Yes to the flower of the mountain. Yes to yes. I say yes. Come on and come, little soul. We accept you. It took a super long time for me to get ready to write the book. That took 5 or 6 years. So I had in mind that I might turn to the material of this period in our lives, not because I wanted to, but because it exerted that kind of psychic pressure that powerful stories exert. Actually really didn't want to work with it as a performer, which is the other part of my creative life. I really didn't want to make a piece about it. But after we'd come back from being in Durham where our daughter received her care, I thought I would make this piece, this performance piece that was just about the body in a very general way, the fragilities of the body, the resilience of the body. And I had this kind of character of a reincarnated woman, this woman who's reluctantly reincarnated, like she's kind of mad about it, that she's back on Earth again. And somehow into that piece, the material from this time in our lives and the voices of some of the children, other children besides our own, who we witnessed going through real hardship and real pain, and also the beauty of how people responded to those children, kept bleeding into that piece. And so I did finally make a performance piece about this material directly. I put aside the other piece altogether. And after I had made a theater piece about it, I thought, oh, what the heck? I'll go ahead and try to write the book, to talk about this in a more straightforward, maybe, way, in a piece of nonfiction, prose. So the actual writing of the book, I would say I wrote in earnest, trying to write every day, which is not my forte, between 3 and 4 years. Yeah. There would be chunks. There's life. Some of us, maybe even some of us whom I live with, have got incredible discipline and will actually write virtually every day. Others of us get distracted and wander off and do something for a couple of months and come back. But in the end, I really did have to force myself. Yeah. Thank you.
Was it hard to write the personal material, or were there parts of it that were especially hard to write?
There were certainly parts of it that were especially hard to write. The hardest parts for me to write were the parts where I'm describing what it was. I mean, as you could well imagine, the hardest parts to write were the parts where our daughter was suffering the most. It was just hard. It's hard to cast your mind back to a period of time where you were really in pain, as much as that pain might be leavened by daily life and the little moments of communion we would have with other parents, the little moments of humor that we managed to carve out with one another, or Gracie's, just like shimmering ability to assert her selfhood, even in the middle of being sick. Those things sustained us. And I certainly tried to bring those into the time of writing about the hospital period. But it was hard. It's interesting. Really, when I thought back about writing about the hospital, there's just that you recoil. You just think that was hard, that hurt, who wants to go there? But in the writing, I discovered some of those other things that as I said, leavened that time and made it more bearable. It's, you often, memory works that way. You often have a kind of monolithic emotional response to a time in your life. And then when you actually go back, of course, like you can with anything, it's more nuanced, right? It did stink when she was in the hospital, but there was also the day when she, the only drug that worked for her to combat nausea was the Marinol, which was the marijuana derivative. It's in oil form. And so she, got this terrific mild high, and also got rid of her stomach ache. And so she, on one day in particular, I remember she motored her bed up. So she had the head all the way up and the feet all the way up. So it was like this little valley, and she would be sliding down one side. And the one beautiful thing about watching her, and I think most kids go through sickness, is that they don't have this embedded self-narration about how sick they are, especially at that age. Our daughter was just 3.5 when we began her bone marrow transplant. So, she could get really sick, like physically be sick to her stomach, or just have like awful, something that's momentary but extreme. And I know if that happened to me, like for a week, I would be like coming up to strangers, like, listen, come here. I'm sick. I've this terrible. And for her, if she would experience it, she'd go through it. She'd wipe her mouth. She'd shake it off. And I just loved that. I loved that when it was over, it was over. That was then, even if then was only 90 seconds ago. And this is now. And she was ready to, find whatever fun thing might be possible in a 10 by 10 hospital room. Oh. It's a very long answer. Sorry. Thank you. I promise to be more brief if anyone else asks a question. Yes. Hi. Okay. Oh, no,
I'm just curious if you wrote at all during these experiences, journal entries or little notes, or even just something on the back of a napkin, just as a way of processing, or do you have a really terrific memory?
I don't have a really terrific memory, and I did write during the time. I actually wrote quite a bit, and when I decided to try to make a book out of this, I naively, optimistically thought, I'll just turn the writing I did when we were there into a book, and that didn't work at all. The kind of writing I was doing then was for a web page that a lot of families kept these web pages. It was the site we used was called Caring Bridge, and you'd meet another family, and the first thing you would say once you felt comfortable with each other was, do you have a Caring Bridge page? And so we were keeping in touch with our family and friends who were far, we were away from home for treatment. We lived in New York at the time, and we'd gone down to Durham, North Carolina, to Duke Medical Center for Gracie's care. And that was a way for us to stay in touch with people back at home. And then it really became this way that you could track the other families you were going through things with. But much more of that writing than I remembered was very nuts and bolts. This is what her hematocrit is today. Tomorrow morning we're getting a sonogram, and it'll tell us about blood flow in the liver. This does not make page-turning storytelling. So it did, however, help so much because a lot of facts were there. And I couldn't remember things even like just how long were we actually in the hospital. But I had that to draw from. And Brian also took notes. And so between the two of us, there was at least some kind of primary documents, if you will. Yeah.
My other question, since I'm still here, is when you thought about turning this, did you think of it really as turning it into a book? You knew you wanted to write a long work, a long story of this, or did it come out in smaller pieces that you then incorporated into a longer book?
That's such a great question, and I wish you'd asked me that 5 years ago. It never occurred to me that I could have just written an essay. It would have been so much easier. Or even that would have been a great way to approach it, actually. Like a series of essays. And I wouldn't have been so tied to this one narrative timeline. I could have leapt around. Next time. And a great question coming from an essayist, as Randon is.
I'm curious, at this time in the United States when healthcare is so front and center, you didn't say anything about the cost of this treatment. So as I sat there listening to you, I am assuming that you were able to bear the cost. And I'm thinking to myself, suppose you weren't able to bear the cost, would she have got that quality of care?
I love this question, and thank you for it. I might begin to bore some people or actually look as though I'm stepping up onto a soapbox with a rant, so just you've been warned. we weren't able to bear the cost all by ourselves, and I'll get to that in a second. And this is just to say how misguided I personally believe a for-profit healthcare system to be. I just, on a fundamental level, I do not understand that structure, that profit motive is the primary driver for caring for our physical well-being. As a society, I don't get it, and I don't agree with it. That was the system we were in. Go ahead. I see like people just suppressing a clap. Go for it in the back. That's fine. Clap for the. But that was the model that was the model we were in. That's the model we're all still in right now, right? Even with Obamacare, it's not socialized medicine. So, or universal payer, or whatever you want to call it. When Gracie got sick, I had no health insurance, because we weren't married yet. Or I had some other something going on. But Gracie was covered under Brian's policies, and Brian, this is my husband, Brian Morton, and Brian was working in 2 different universities. He had a primary plan, and he had a secondary plan because he had health insurance through both universities. The primary plan, leads the way. They tell you what's covered and what's not. They refused to allow us to go to the place we wanted to go, Duke, because they said that's not in, that's too expensive. It's outside your network. You have to go to a closer center. The closer center where they wanted us to go had done 12, if I'm remembering the numbers right, 12 transplants with what we had, which was cord blood. Cord blood was kind of new at the time. This was all, the reading I did was all about having the second baby. Well, he arrives and he is a match, and we can try to cure our daughter. So we needed to use his cord blood. It was a new way of transplanting, and the place they directed us to go had done 12. Brian did some research. We got lucky, got sent in the right direction. We found a center that had done something like 250. So where would you like to go to have your child's life taken into their hands? The people who have the experience of doing 12 or doing 250? And we fought this. We sent it all the way up the chain with our health care, and they denied us at every single juncture. No, you must go to the place that's done 12. Good luck. Good luck to you and your 3.5-year-old daughter who's already been through medical hell. Incredibly, we had this second insurance policy, this secondary insurance, because Brian was working in 2 places in order to get, and that policy was more generous. And so in order to go where we wanted, to Duke that had done 250, we had to drop the first insurance. We had to drop it. And the secondary insurance became primary, and they covered, much of the cost of the medical care. There was still, Brian had to keep working, of course, and that meant he was commuting back and forth. We had these 2 households, I think for a period of time we subletted in New York, but we have this apartment now in Durham. I wasn't working. We had an infant somebody had to stay with our infant son while Brian was working in New York and I was in the hospital room. I literally could not keep our infant son with us. There are all these, subsidiary costs. For those costs, which had been estimated to us ahead of time as being about $85,000, what we could expect, because we'd spend a year in Durham. For those costs, we started this fundraising campaign. Some of the friends who supported us through that and made that possible are here tonight. We were super, super lucky in that we had 2 insurance policies, one to fall back on. We had a network of friends who were, had enough spare time and energy to run a fundraising campaign. We ended up raising that money. But of course there were families there that did not have that. The wheel spun for us, and we were already, lucky in in the employment we had. We were already lucky in the, you know, the economic class we were in at the beginning of the process. We still couldn't afford it all on our own, but we were already lucky. You should not have to spin a wheel and land in the lucky spot in order to be cared for. If not soul, then at least body, you know. In a wealthy, wealthy, wealthy society like this, why not provide for one another? I thank you so much for raising that issue. I mean, class plays into this. There were children being treated at Duke from every class that I could see, but the kids who were from a lower economic class who were there, you know, they got lucky. Again, it was happenstance, or they lived nearby there. They hadn't come from Oklahoma to be at Duke. It was, again, that spin of the wheel, and it should not be so capricious. It should be, by design, we're all getting the best care possible. And that care it's there. And we have the resources to do it if we end up ever with the political will and the social oomph. Yeah. Thank you very much.